soon after the Russian Russo-Japanese War, Russia lost the control of southern Manchuria to Japan, but they kind of maintained the railroad in the northern Manchuria, and they have their sphere of influence. But then Russian Revolution happened. Um, Wait, no, the Qing Empire actually got overthrown in 1911, and
Yeah, yeah.
that was before the First World War, and when the Qing Empire collapsed, all the Chinese provinces were declared independence, and Outer Mongolia also declared independence. That's where they got the Mongol Khan got the backing from the Tsars, from the Russian government. And so they are able to sort of maintain their quasi independence, because their independence was not recognized internationally, but because they have the Russian backing, the new Republic of China, they couldn't send the army there because they're also busy fight. The different warlords in China also busy fighting among themselves. So in 1922, in 1920s, the Chinese warlord briefly sent an army to occupy Outer Mongolia again, but then what's that guy's name? The white
Ungern von Sternberg.
Yes.
Roman Fyodorovich Ungern Sternberg.
The Bloody Baron.
The White Baron. He moved his white army and his white army and Mongol Buryat army into Outer Mongolia to kick out the Chinese, and took it for himself. He wanted to make it his base of his Eurasian empire, but then the Red Army followed and kicked him out. And so the Red Army then propped up the Mongol communists to form a communist state. But again, Mongolia is de facto independent, but was not officially recognized by other countries. So in 1945, Stalin made a deal to Chiang Kai-shek. So like, look, we'll sign this treaty. You will recognize Outer Mongolia's formal independence, and we will guarantee the territorial integrity of the rest of China. So because the Soviet Red Army occupied Manchuria after the August storm in August 1945, when a million Red Army crossed the border to defeat the Japanese Kwantung Army over there. And so, but Stalin said, look, we signed this treaty. We'll return Manchuria to you. We'll not interfere in Xinjiang, because in 1940s, in 1930s, Xinjiang was controlled by a Chinese warlord, but it was run almost like a satellite state of Soviet Union, because the Chinese warlord Sensei depended on the Soviet support to maintain his rule in Xinjiang. So for a while, Xinjiang was a Soviet satellite state. But then in 1941, when Hitler was launching the Battle of Moscow, and right after the and in December, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered the war. So Sensei thought, okay, so U.S. entered the war. Chiang Kai-shek is an ally of United States, but it looked like Moscow is about to fall to the Nazi Germany. So maybe I need to make my future plan. So he decided to purge all the communists in Xinjiang province. He had Mao's, at that time, Mao's younger brother was serving as his finance minister. So he had Mao's younger brother arrested and executed. And then he and he kicked out all the Soviet, most of the Soviet Red Army already left Xinjiang by then, because, the German army was at the wall of Moscow. So he kicked out the rest of the Soviet Red Army advisors, and he made appeal to Chiang Kai-shek to say, okay, I'm your man now. I'm now only loyal to you. Stalin didn't like that. So a few years later, in 1944, the Soviet Union supported a
Yeah,
bunch of a bunch of
Turkestan Republic,
Yeah.
the East Turkestan
they
Republic.
supported a
Yeah.
bunch of Kazakh and Uyghur communists and also a bunch of Islamists to launch the rebellion in northern Xinjiang and establish the Second Turkestan Islamic Republic. And so this was a situation when these are the cards that Stalin had in his pocket when he negotiated with Chiang Kai-shek. He's like, look, we'll settle the Xinjiang issue. We'll settle the Manchuria issue. We'll return Xinjiang and Manchuria all to you. We'll guarantee China's territorial integrity, but you have to recognize Outer Mongolia's independence. So Chiang Kai-shek agreed. So and also to recognize the Soviet privilege in Port Arthur. Soviet was supposed to have continue the 99-year lease on Port Arthur. So then this was after the Japanese surrender. Japan still had like a several million man army that's camped out in China, and they control most of the major city in northern China, whereas Chiang Kai-shek's army all hold up in the southwestern China. So the Mao's communists actually were closer because their communist base were in the rural area in the northern China. So United States didn't want northern China to fall to the communists, so they started to ship Chiang Kai-shek's KMT army to northern China by rail and by American Navy. And when the Soviets saw that American Navy were sending Chiang Kai-shek's men closer to Manchuria, at that time they were alarmed because they realized, okay, if post-war China is going to be like a junior partner to United States, kind of like how Japan is now playing that role for United States. If Chiang Kai-shek is going to be like Uncle Sam's man, that might threaten the Soviet privilege in Manchuria. They didn't want that. They didn't want Americans to get into Manchuria. So at that time, they changed the tactic to support the communists. And they allowed the communists to march into Manchuria and to take over all the arms depot of the surrendered Japanese Kwangtung Army, and then and when the Soviet also controlled the port of Dalian, this port city of Dalian, the Soviet just want the port. They just want the port for the Soviet Navy. They have no interest to actually manage a Chinese city. So they allowed the Chinese communists to take effective control of the city of Dalian to run all the administrations. And they also hand over the Japanese munition factories in Dalian to the Chinese communists, which end up supplying the communists during the Civil War. And so it's because the background of the Soviet-U.S. Cold War. This is why Stalin's attitude kind of changed a couple of times, and finally he gave full support to the Chinese communists that eventually enabled the communists to take over Manchuria during the Chinese Civil War, and Manchuria was one of the most industrialized place in China. It held like 90% of Chinese industrial production in 1945. So once communists control Manchuria, it was game over for Chiang Kai-shek. Basically, communists were able to win the Civil War. In 1949, kicked Chiang Kai-shek to Taiwan, and that was a period of Sino-Soviet honeymoon period, because Soviets still had the Port Arthur, but somehow, I know what happened. I think it's because in return for getting the Chinese involvement in the Korean War, in 1955, I think was when Soviet Union finally signed the treaty with newly established People's Republic China, where they they returned the Port Arthur to the Chinese control.
Yeah, I'm still a bit salty at Khrushchev for that. Because
Yeah, that was. I think that's because that was a prize for getting the Chinese involved in the Korean War. I'm pretty sure that was so.
Yeah.
So after that, China resumed control of Dalian, the city of Dalian. Before that, up to from 1945 to 1955, about 10 years, the Soviet Red Army and the Soviet Far East Navy headquarters was in Dalian. And another thing that alarmed the Soviet was Americans. The Americans, after 1945, they saw that Soviet Far East Navy made their headquarters in Port Arthur. So Americans, the Seventh Fleet, decide to make its port in just across the water in the Shandong Peninsula. For people who look at the map, you can see the Liaodong Peninsula. There's a very narrow passage of water. So on the other side, in the southern side, the Americans want to set up the 7th Fleet headquarters in a place called Yantai. But when they arrived, Yantai was already taken over by the Chinese communists. So they have to go to Qingdao. After 1945, Qingdao became the headquarters of American 7th Fleet. So basically, for a period of a couple of years, the Soviet Far East Pacific Fleet and the American 7th Fleet, they were like, their headquarters were just like basically next to each other for a couple during this Chinese Civil War. Yeah. Anyway.
This is crazy. I think that Kirill just found his match at autistically reciting history book with no breaks. Guys, this is premium content though. Like I don't know, Douyin video narrating the entire Russo-Chinese history in 20 minutes. No, this is great. But